hear from the leaders of MIT, the trustees of the MIT Corporation. So our first session includes a panel of both a former and a current member of the corporation, together with a national expert on university trustees. This discussion will be led by John Chisholm. So John is MIT class of 76, BS and MS in Core 6, serial entrepreneur, venture investor, MIT Corporation member from 2015 to 2021, and the holder of way too many other MIT roles and awards to name now. So John will come up and bring up his panel and introduce them. John, the stage is yours.
Good morning, everybody. It's so wonderful to be here. Thanks so much for being here and for having me. Let me introduce our two panelists. Steve Baker is a member of the MIT Corporation. Steve, come on up, which is, of course, MIT's Board of Trustees. He serves on the Corporation Joint Advisory Committee, known as CJAC, and he chairs a subcommittee of CJAC that, at MIT President Sally Kornbluth's request, is exploring ways to foster civil discourse at MIT. He's a longtime volunteer at MIT, has served as president and chair of the MIT Alumni Association in 2022-2023. And outside of MIT, Steve is founder of BWA Architecture, a 25-person architectural firm in Boston where he lives and works. Please welcome Steve Baker. Michael Poliakoff, come on up, Michael, has served since 2016 as the president of the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, or ACTA. ACTA, an independent nonprofit based in DC, is dedicated to promoting academic freedom, excellence, and accountability at America's colleges and universities. Under Michael's leadership, ACTA supported the formation and early growth of the MIT Free Speech Alliance and the broader Alumni Free Speech Alliance. A Rhodes Scholar, Michael has taught classical languages and civilization at Wellesley, Georgetown, Hillsdale, and George Mason. Please welcome Michael Poliakoff. Gentlemen, welcome. Wonderful to be here with you. And I'll start out asking our panelists a few questions, and then we'll open it up for general questions and Q&A. I'd like to start by reviewing the current state of free speech and expression on university campuses in general and at MIT in specifically. A bit later, as I mentioned, we'll focus on the role of trustees. So, Michael, if you would start us out, what is the current state of free speech and expression on university campuses today?
I'm going to take the opportunity first to say a great thank you. You have to have a heart of stone and the brain of a tadpole not to be energized by being on the MIT campus and seeing the extraordinary things that happen. Just walking around, seeing from street level the interactions of the students in their laboratories. This is very heartening. You know, gives me a good sense for the future of the country. And of course, MFSA has been an emblem, has been a watchword for alumni organizations. And we'll be talking a little bit more, I'm sure, throughout the day about the things that you have achieved, the very substantive things. You know, chief among them, driving out the infamous required diversity statements, and on the positive side, ensuring that there's a firm statement of freedom of speech. And I know Professor Rabier will be here later on, this vibrant debate culture. These are solutions. These are great things. So to turn to your question, it's bad. nationally, the data show us that there's a lot of ground that needs to be covered. I'm going to, since this is MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, I'm going to start with a quote from Euripides' play, The Hippolytus. We understand and recognize what is worthy, but we do not see it through, some through sloth, others putting pleasure above what is noble. There are many pleasures in life, long conversations and leisure, a pleasant vice, and then there is shameful indecisiveness. And I leave it to all of you to fill in the names that you would like to attach to all of those particular vices. But yes, we've got a very, very challenging situation. And actually, another preface before we get to that, the problems of higher education, I want to stress that we need to do this out of love. I appreciated President Stargart's introduction. You are here because you love this university. There are huge problems with higher education, but I have no patience whatsoever for the burn it down approach. There is too much at stake. It's a childish reaction, and some of it is coming from state and federal leaders. We need to argue forcefully against it. So now to answer your question after that long rambling introduction. Annenberg finds that 79% of the American public can identify the First Amendment as protecting freedom of speech, and that's up 5 points from the preceding year. That's a good sign. And a reasonably robust 70% of Americans in the band of 45 to 64 years old, according to a YouGov poll, agree with Charlie Kirk, the late Charlie Kirk's dictum: there's ugly speech, there's gross speech, there's evil speech, and it's all protected by the First Amendment. That drops to 59% for ages 18 through 29. And across party lines, recent Wall Street Journal article, 80% of Americans reject violence as a means of shutting down unwanted speech. But here's the kicker. For Generation Z, that drops to 58%. And I want to emphasize on the other side, we need to worry a lot about what Pam Bondi and her colleagues are saying about free speech. The desire to censor is an equal opportunity vice, and we've all got to be very cognizant of threats from both sides. So let's connect some dots. YouGov's results are a finger post to colleges and universities as a major cause of the national problem. Only 31% of the public believing that colleges are sorry, I shouldn't have said only, 31% of the public believing that colleges and universities are a major threat to free speech. Think about that. And another 34% seeing it as somewhat of a threat. Only 32% of the American public would say that colleges are not a threat to freedom of speech. This is a world turned upside down. And our classical liberal friends from across the pond have been pointing this out for a while in The Economist. They've brought with them, this is talking about the college graduates in America, tactics to enforce ideological purity, no platforming their enemies, and canceling allies who have transgressed. So they're pointing the finger exactly at us, and this is on us to correct. As President Stargart said, violence is, according to the Fire poll, acceptable for 34% of college students, and the extremes of right and left concur at 36-37%. Willingness to shout down has gone from 66% to 71%. Harvard's own data shows that 51% of the faculty would rather not talk about anything that has any controversy around it, and 45% of the students share that feeling of inhibition. Turning to Princeton, Princetonians for Free Speech, in 2023, their survey showed that only 24% of the students would agree that it's never acceptable to shout down a speaker, and 41% of the student body believe faculty and administrators attempt to indoctrinate them. Now, the Daily Princetonian itself did a survey in 2023, not in 2025, with these questions. They shot the messenger because the findings were so bad. 84% of the very liberal seniors felt that they were comfortable sharing their views, and that dropped to 13% for libertarians and 27% for conservatives. Now, President Eisgruber pronounced, "We have civil discourse on this campus." Really? This is what we're up against. So I'll stop there. There are solutions. I don't want to leave us wallowing in how bad it is. There is a way forward.
Well, we'll have a chance to talk about those momentarily.
Can I just
Steve,
add-
yes, what are your thoughts?
So I just, Wayne mentioned in his introduction some very similar parallel statistics at MIT. And I would just note that, so what you see is that MIT is not an outlier here. It's very much, it feels like these statistics that Michael just mentioned align with the statistics that Wayne just mentioned. So this is a problem across the country. And I know we're very focused on MIT, as we should be, but recognize that this is a national problem.
It is indeed.
So,
Would you say it's, how is MIT similar? How is MIT different from the national case, Steve,
well,
in terms of free speech?
so broadly similar, but, in terms of where we are at MIT today, well, first, let me say, also, I thank you for the opportunity to be here. I thank you all for being here, for your passion around this subject. And I'd like to note that as a member of the corporation, I am here in my personal capacity, and the opinions that I express are my own. I am not speaking for MIT today. I want to make sure that's clear. Overall, I think the trend at MIT is very positive. Now, granted, it started from a relatively low base. We can all acknowledge that. But the movement in general is very positive. And I think we've seen that in some of the objective measures that have been mentioned. I think Michael will probably mention the ACTA Gold standard later, but you saw MIT almost double its score in that. The FIRE rankings that Wayne mentioned. So those some objective, relatively objective data points that I think reflect that the move is in the right direction. I would say at MIT it's mixed, but generally positive. I think on the positive side, I think you have a leadership, not only the administrative leadership, but the faculty are really full-throat support for freedom of expression. And I think that has become clear in some of the actions that the Institute has taken over the last couple of years. I can tell you personally, from my dealings with President Kornbluth, Sally Kornbluth, she is an absolute believer in the importance of freedom of expression and the importance of open discourse, that subjects should not be off the table. And I think that the faculty, especially the more senior faculty, definitely agree with that, as you see by the adoption of the Statement of Freedom of Expression, similar to the Chicago Principles. I think the Abbott affair really was an eye-opener for them. I think that people probably at the upper reaches of the university had no idea what was happening in the student body in regard to this area. And because of that, that was a wake-up call, and now you have seen a lot of progress made in the last 3 years, starting with the Committee on Academic Freedom of Expression, and then moving on, and now there is a faculty committee on this subject. I'm sorry, the name has slipped my mind at the moment. I know that there's been discussion about adopting a statement of institutional neutrality. The campus has not officially done that, but my impression is that it is informally, that is in place, and that you do not see the university expressing opinions about publicly expressing opinions about subjects that are not directly related to the work of the Institute. So all good things, very good things. On the other hand, We have the statistics that Wayne and Michael have mentioned, especially about the student body. You know, it's chilling that 32% of the students think that it is sometimes okay to use violence to suppress speech. Now, I want to dig into that methodology, that survey methodology a little. We're waiting to hear more from FIRE on that, because I'm sure, as many of you know, you can get the result you want depending on how you ask a question. So I think we need to see that. But still, nonetheless, I think we can all agree that that is really dreadful. Also, my perception, and I think that Michael mentioned it, is that as you move down towards Gen Z or younger people, you see more tolerance for restricting speech. And that is true at MIT, not just among the students, but also among a lot of the more junior administrators, and a lot of those, the student affairs professionals, many of whom are charged with enforcing the code of conduct, I think are often more willing to impose limits on speech, you know, and can ponder that, why that is. I think it's probably a reflection of their lived experience. The fact is, if you're dealing with this stuff on a day-to-day basis, the easiest thing to say is, look, we're just not going to let anybody talk about anything, and then we won't have any issues. But I think that's a concern. And of course, then to the students themselves, many of them clearly are fairly radical on this matter, as the statistics quoted mentioned. And I think the students are the largest single constituency at MIT in terms of the size of the group. So those opinions do matter. Even if we may all strongly disagree with them, it is a context in which MIT has to operate. You know, so I'm sure we'll talk about more of that, about that as we go, but just I think we need to recognize that we cannot simply dismiss that section, that third or actually 80% of the student body who thinks it's okay to occasionally shout down a speaker. So I'll stop there.
There certainly has been a sea change in the 2.5 years Sally's been on board. In my view, under Raphael Reif, her predecessor, our previous president, Raphael would freely write op-ed pieces for the Boston Globe, seemingly quarterly, and Sally's been much more restrained on doing that kind of thing. I often cite 4 good things that have happened in the 2.5 years that Sally has been president. One, emphatically adopting the Free Expression Working Group's report, which, as you mentioned, is essentially the Chicago Principles. 2, personally inaugurating the Dialogues Across Differences lecture series, at which John Tomasi of Heterodox University was the first speaker. 3, speaking at one of our events at the MIT Free Speech Alliance, Ask Me Anything type event. And 4, most importantly, eliminating the requirement for compelled DEI statements, after which many other universities followed suit. Steve, are these actions representative of Sally's leadership overall, or am I just cherry picking?
No,
and what could MIT still do, and what challenges does MIT still face? Yeah.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I think the actions that you described very much reflect President Kornbluth's thinking around this subject, which is, as I said in my introduction, I think she is a full-throated believer and supporter of freedom of expression, and I think these actions demonstrate that. So in my interactions with her and my conversations with her, and I've had several around this subject, dating back to shortly after she was inaugurated, I think that she has always expressed a belief that we need more speech, we need more civic discourse, civil discourse, and that we need to all be supportive of the right of individuals to express opinions in a responsible and civil manner. So, yeah, I think I hope we can all agree that President Kornbluth is a real ally in this matter. As far as what MIT could be doing that it is not, there's one item that I would really like to see, and that's the adoption of some kind of mandatory training or education around this area.
Yes.
A number of universities have now, including Harvard this year, have started requiring first-year students to take training on the importance of freedom of expression. And I think that that is something that MIT could and should be doing. And the committee that I am chairing, I am pretty sure is going, we just started work, but we've already talked about this issue, that we're going to recommend that MIT introduce some required education around the subject of the importance of civil discourse and respecting freedom of expression. Beyond that, there are a lot of other programs that the MIT is offering that, and you mentioned like the dialogues across differences, which I've also attended a couple of those, and what I note is that the audience is by and large not students. The audience is staff, faculty, and so I think MIT hopefully could do a better job of outreach to the students about some of these programs and encouraging participation in the programs that already exist. So.
Michael, you have a broader perspective from which to look at MIT and many other universities, and ACTA's gold standard program rates and ranks them. Tell us about that program and how you perceive, how does MIT perform on your criteria?
Absolutely, and Steve, I couldn't agree more. Now, one of those criteria in the gold standard is, in fact, the orientation and the training, training for staff and training for students. We are embarking on a major cultural change. This is not easy. I'll pull T.S. Eliot out of the air. Virtues thrust upon us by our impudent crimes that go all the way back into K-12. You know, the evidence has been in front of us for a long time. You know, the coddling of the American mind and a bad teacher training system that puts people in front of K-12 classrooms who are themselves ideology-addled and are going to do the same to their students. It is not easy to turn this terrible situation around, but that's what's in front of us, and we've got to do it. It's low-hanging fruit for the university, and there are great models out there. This is what Mitch Daniels did at Purdue, and it's had a great effect. Our organization, the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, has a very vibrant program of college debate and discourse, and Linda Rabier has picked that up here and has run with it even more aggressively. There's nothing better for students than to have to participate in an open debate, parliamentary style, and hear things that they don't particularly agree with and don't like, or to use Oliver Wendell Holmes' phrase, think that they are fraught with death. And yet that's the best training for them. I will say that in 500 debates we've done, with more than 20,000 students participating, we've never seen an instance of incivility. Now, if you want to see that, go to a faculty meeting. So, you know, the fact is there are things we can do. But to answer your question about the gold standard, I put copies of it out there, 20 criteria for the protection, the fostering and protection of freedom of expression. I'm sorry to say in this university where there's no grade inflation, you get somewhere like a 10 or 11. We're just kind of refining the rubric. We're doing report cards for schools all around the country. Some of them, I can't reveal names yet, have gotten as high as 18 out of 20. These are not such tremendous things to do. Well, I take that back. Changing the faculty hiring system, which is going to be crucial, is obviously a greater lift. But training, orientation, no, this is something right in front of you.
So did you just say that MIT ranks 11 or 12 out of 20?
Oh, no. Of the 20 criteria,
Yes,
manage,
rates, not ranks.
yeah, 10 or 11, that's an F.
But where does MIT fall down in your view, and what, if anything, is MIT doing well according to your criteria?
Well, some things that would be easy to do. Free expression in student orientations. That's, as we just talked about, very, very easy to do. Making it part of presidential search. Now, you've got a good president who's trying very hard, but this ought to be one of the really, really clear criteria. When you are looking for a president, what's that person's record on freedom of speech? Get rid of your bias incident response team. At public universities, the courts have generally found these things to be chilling the climate for free speech. The punishment is in the process. How much fun is it to be turned in an anonymous reporting system and have to say that, no, I'm not a hopeless racist, and here's the evidence. This is awful. Get rid of this thing. And that could be done by fiat, by trustees. Sorry, guys, we've seen what the Fifth Circuit has ruled, and even though we're a private university, we're going to follow best practice. Make sure that Title IX and disciplinary procedures don't infringe on freedom of speech. So, yes, within a few weeks, I think we can give you the final rating of where MIT could improve. And I want to put it in those terms. Could. It's on a trajectory.
Michael, if I could compare ACTA's gold standard with FIRE's rankings, your gold standards focus on actions the universities are taking, it seems to me, correct me if I'm mistaken, and FIRE, whose rankings are based on surveys of attitudes and intentions and such, are more focused on outcomes. Would that be a fair distinction between ACTA and FIRE on this?
I think that is fair. The FIRE rankings will give you a snapshot at a point in time. I would encourage, this is another place where MIT could rise in the rating system, do a real campus climate survey. That's to say, 1,500 plus students, so you can actually do it at a granular level. What's it like to be a religious student on this campus, a conservative student? And really be able to say with some sense, more than a sample of a couple hundred, 300 students, where are we? Where can we improve? That's, again, it's just a question of money. It's not a vast amount. 20, 30K will get you a pretty good campus climate survey, and then you have real data to work from.
Steve, you spent a lot of time on campus as a result of co-chairing CJAC and other activities. What's your reaction to the assessment, Michael's assessment through the gold standard?
Sure. Before we get to that, if I could just speak to, add a little bit context to Michael's remark about bias response team. So I think it's important to note that the MIT bias response team, which is within the IHDR Institute Harassment and Office, I'm sorry, again, blocking on the name, was created in 2011 in response to guidance/direction issued by the Department of Education in the infamous Dear Colleague letter. Some of you may recall that. And that letter basically said that all universities have a duty to prevent harassment and prevent hostile environment. And so that was the genesis of the bias response. It was not something that MIT came up with on its own. So, obviously the administration has changed, I guess 3 times since then, but that, as far as I know, that letter has not been rescinded. And you may know more, Michael.
I believe that it has been.
It has
but
been.
The fact of the matter is, until these things get into statute, there's no guarantee that you won't see something like that coming back. Title IX, for example, has gone through 3 stages. It's in a pretty good place now, but will that remain?
So fair enough, thank you. But to your question, John, about the ACTA standards, I think that they're an excellent tool for generally evaluating the campus environment. And so I applaud the work that ACTA is doing in creating them, and hopefully I look forward to seeing more publicization of those standards, because I think it will be helpful. Though, as I mentioned to Michael earlier this morning, the one place where I don't want to say I take exception to ACTA, but one thing I would like to ACTA maybe to put a little bit more focus on is, in addition, I think the ACTA standards are very focused on individual rights, which absolutely are important. I'd like to see a little bit more emphasis on collective responsibility, so that not only do we all have individual rights, but we all have a responsibility to A, express our views in a civil and politic manner, and we all have responsibility to ensure that the larger culture encourages, fosters the ability for people to do that. So that we have a responsibility to make sure that the campus is welcoming of views that may be different than our own. And so just kind of a minor tweak, as I've already mentioned, I do think that there's been a lot of movement in this area in a positive direction, but we do have more work to do.
Yeah, thank you. And let me broaden that to an invitation. This is a work in progress. We've rolled it out within the last 18 months, and we're very, very open to suggestions from those who are on the front lines. What I envision, what I hope for, is to see that day when students wouldn't think of canceling a speaker, who would embrace heterodoxy, who wouldn't need the top-down sanctions that we certainly do recommend for people who break that code. When we get there, then we really are going back to that time. It's not entirely nostalgic fantasy that people with white hair or no hair at all remember as being the college environment. That's what we need to restore.
Gentlemen, how do the various titles of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as they're currently being implemented or executed in Washington, affect universities and their free speech policies, either broadly or specifically at MIT? And of course, there's Title IV, which is public education, Title VI, federally funded programs, Title VII, employment, Title IX, prohibition of sex-based discrimination in education or other federally funded programs. What are your thoughts on that?
I'll immediately defer to anyone in the audience who's a constitutional lawyer, but to give a rough and ready layman's view, Title VI is the one that has been now very much in use by the administration, preventing discrimination on campus. And this is indeed a very good thing. How it's actually applied becomes really very important, and some of it is only going to get worked out in litigation. What constitutes a level of harassment that prevents a member of a minority group from being able to pursue his or her education? When is there unequal access to education? Now, an encampment that basically starts asking people, are you a Zionist? And if you are, you can't get to the classroom, that's pretty clear. But what is a severe and pervasive kind of harassment that creates a climate in which a person's education is obstructed? The administration, the federal administration, has certainly used that to give quite a prod to especially elite colleges and universities in the issue of anti-Semitism. How that can chill free speech is, of course, something that we need to be keeping an eye on, and that's why I think some of this will get resolved in the courts. There are unpleasant conversations that happen over issues that people feel very strongly about. That's not Title VI violation. And where those lines are, what a neutral third-party observer would deem to be a violation, again, is something that is a case-by-case, fact-driven issue. I'm not sure I clarified anything for anybody here.
Yeah, complicated subject. Well, first, John, thanks for asking that question, because I do think it gives a chance to maybe clarify a couple of issues. First, you mentioned Title IX. I suspect that everybody in the room has heard of Title IX. It's about gender-based discrimination in education, most often associated with women's college sports. But it's obviously much broader than that. And the Dear Colleague letter that I mentioned a couple of moments ago was issued, in fact, pursuant to Title IX of the Civil Rights Act. So, that was really around hostile environment, specifically around discrimination towards women. Michael mentioned Title VI. I will also note, I'm an architect. I am not a constitutional lawyer, but we are living with this experience, so we've seen it. I've had a number of alumni over the years say, why isn't MIT's free of expression policy simply the First Amendment? What is permitted by the First Amendment should be allowed at MIT. And unfortunately, Title VI imposes more significant constraints. And Michael mentioned the issue of creating or allowing a hostile environment to persist. What does that mean? Again, as each administration comes and goes, they may refine or change the definition of what is a hostile environment. And so, as we saw, for instance, under the Obama administration, it was pretty strictly regulated. I think the current administration maybe perhaps would take a more relaxed view, except when it comes to anti-Semitism. So, what we've seen is in the current administration, anti-Semitism is completely off limits. But other forms of freedom of expression seem to be okay. So, I do think what you see is there's some shifting sand depending on who's in charge. And the universities have to respond to that. And I will say at MIT, it's a big place. It moves slowly. So when you get new guidance, it can take years to cultivate and put new policies in place. So in that sense, we're always a little behind the times because, the university acts by consensus. And so when you get new guidance, then committees are formed and, various groups are consulted, and that all takes a while. So again, like Michael said, I'm not sure I've really clarified anything, but I will note that, we do live under the constraints of Title VI, which is more restrictive than the First Amendment.
I was just going to add, if I may, we should not ignore the admonition of former president of Harvard, past President Larry Summers. A president should exercise moral leadership. That's not only the president, that is the board. And there are places where it's not a matter of law, it's a matter of moral leadership, which, by the way, does not violate institutional neutrality. And again, it's a balance that's going to distinguish great leadership from mediocre leadership. To be able to do, for example, what Chancellor Diermeyer has been able to do at Vanderbilt. So, yeah, it's one of those somewhat subjective factors that we ought to include when we're dealing with these very sensitive, not very bright lines between freedom of speech and harassment.
I was on the corporation before Steve from 2015 to 2021, and it's interesting how things have evolved before and after the disinvitation of Dorian Abbott and how self-censorship has evolved. I was on the library's visiting committee, and the visiting committees meet for a day and a half, about once every 12 to 18 months. And the longest single session in our day and a half together was on DEI. It was about half a day out of that day and a half meeting. And each of the visiting committees gives a report at the corporation meetings. And our chair and the head of the libraries gave their report and talked about DEI, of course. And I said, and during the Q&A and discussion after the visiting committee presentation, I said I appreciated the DEI discussion because I grew up deeply closeted in Southern Florida in the 1970s when it was not okay to be openly gay. And But I wondered, and so I appreciated how the DEI discussion focused on people of different sexual orientations and ethnicities and so forth. But I asked how welcoming or included in the libraries would a conservative Christian or a Republican or a Trump supporter feel in the libraries? Would we even knowingly hire somebody like that into the MIT libraries? I doubt it. And if there were anyone like that in the libraries, they would have to be deeply closeted, I'm sure. Well, there was total silence after I made this remark, as you can imagine, in the corporation meeting. And but afterwards, during the break, which happened immediately after, a dozen people came up to me privately and said, "Oh, I really agree with what you said. You made a good point," and so forth. And even Marty Schmidt, who was then provost of MIT, came up to me and said, "John, you know, sometimes I think the hardest thing to be on campus is a Republican." So later on in the discussion, we'll talk about specific actions those of us who are trustees can take, and courage, and to speak out, and finding others on the corporation or committee or whatever you are with whom you have common ground, I think is an important thing that each of us can take, because there is strength in numbers. I also wanted to add one thing about that I recently discovered about the First Amendment from John Hasnas, who is a Georgetown Law School professor, in his excellent new book, Common Law Liberalism. The question often arises, what did the founders really intend in the First Amendment? Did they intend no law at all, limiting free speech and expression and the press? Or did they want to allow some laws, some legislation that might preclude it? Well, to answer this question of what their intent is, it's helpful to look at the state constitutions that preceded the federal constitution, Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, and others. And all of those state constitutions have substantially the same language as the federal Constitution, but with an additional proviso. The language of the state constitutions, which is substantially the same as the federal, is, no law shall ever be made to restrain free speech or the press, and every citizen may freely speak, write, or print on any subject, or words, or comparable words. But with this additional proviso, being responsible for the abuse of that liberty. Now, where did the enforcement of this being responsible for the abuse of that liberty come from? Not legislation, but case law, common law, the common law we inherited from Great Britain. So there was no need in the founders' mind for legislation at all, because the common law of the states would guard against it. And if things like defamation or incitement or obscenity needed to be unprotected speech, that law was part of common law. So I think it's interesting that really the founders intended no statutes at all, not even something like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is substantially statutory rather than common law, as prohibiting free speech. So I just wanted to interject that. Well, gentlemen, let's turn to trustees specifically. Michael, as head of ACTA, you interact with lots of trustees of universities across the country. What are trustees doing to advance the cause of free speech and expression on campuses? And what should they be doing that they're currently not doing?
I'll start with the second part of that question. Trustees have the power. They don't necessarily recognize that awesome opportunity and responsibility to use it. Trustees, for good reason, delegate responsibility to various sectors. But I will quote Mitch Daniels, Chief of Staff. She gave me permission on this one. Shared governance does not mean no governance. And if the party to whom some part of that power has been given is not exercising it, it goes back to the trustees to set it right. We have some really, really positive examples of what boards, thoughtful boards, have been doing. University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, second university in the nation after Chicago to adopt the Calvin Committee report on institutional neutrality. They did that before the pandemic, just because they thought it was the right thing to do. They reaffirmed their commitment to the Chicago principles at the same time. When they recognized that they were doing a bad job in preparing graduates for informed and engaged citizenship, they accelerated the formation of the School of Civic Life and Leadership. Wonderful catfight that we all had with the accreditor over that, who felt that they were overstepping, and I was proud to be quoted in the Wall Street Journal for calling for an investigation of the accreditor for being out of its lane in trying to block such an important initiative. But that's all by way of saying this body recognized its power and responsibility to get things done. Purdue partnership between President Daniels and the board. The faculty was taking forever to have some kind of civic education requirement, and so the board did it. The tuition at Purdue has been frozen for at least 12 years. These are things that a president acting with a strong board can effect. Texas Board of Regents, the University of Texas, Austin was digging, not just dragging its heels, but digging its heels in against passing the Chicago Principles Statement, which the students had asked for. Well, with a little bit of prodding, I claim some of it came from ACTA. The Board of Regents, unanimous vote, made that obligatory for all the Texas universities and required the Calvin Committee report as well. University of Colorado, the Regents unanimously passed a requirement for the campuses to use value-added assessment of student cognitive gain. All over the country, there are these examples of what a board can do. But most important, a reform-minded president has to know that the board has his or her back, because it's a very lonely position to be out there facing a vote of no confidence. And it's necessary for the board to say politely but firmly, well, faculty, students, we don't have complete confidence in you either. And so we see these as things that have to happen. Bottom line, which is what we're seeing now, if boards are not proactive, another actor will step in to set things right. The catalyst for breaking down so much of the DEI empire has been external. It's been the federal government. That should never have been necessary. And so, the thing to do is to look at best practice around the nation and to be proactive.
Steve, how about the MIT Corporation?
Sure, thanks. Good points, Michael, really good points. First, again, to set a little bit of context, I think it's important to understand the context in which all of this is happening. And at MIT and probably many other universities, you have these sort of overlapping but distinct spheres of governance. There's the Board of Trustees, corporation. There's the senior administration, President Kornbluth and her team, the chancellor and provost and so on. There's the faculty. And I can tell you at a major research university, the faculty have a very, very large voice. Because they're the rainmakers, to use a commercial term. And then, not least, there are the students. Students have their own student governance systems, and they are very jealous of preserving their prerogatives, and they tend to react very, very negatively when they perceive that those prerogatives are being encroached upon. I think all of those groups probably do. So with that context, there are sort of limits on what any one of those groups can do, including the Board of Trustees. I absolutely agree with what Michael said. I think then probably the biggest thing we can do is have the president's back and the administration's back when they are trying to improve things in this situation. And I think MIT's corporation has demonstrated that it has done that. As one example, after the rather infamous testimony that occurred back in November of 2023 before Congress, where you had 3 college presidents, the MIT board, after that testimony, immediately issued a statement in support of the president. Harvard and University of Pennsylvania did not. And we saw what happened. So not directly related to freedom of expression, but to the larger point of protecting, defending the president against outside malign influence. I will note, I think back to the shared governance issue, because these are of those shared governance, a lot of this universities operate by consensus. They are generally not top-down, especially not private universities and sort of the major research universities, because of the power that the faculty have as being the rainmakers. So they do operate by consensus, and because of that, generally quiet conversation works better than banging on publicly. So I think you would see that most trustees, in my experience, tend to find it better to operate in the background and to express their views, if they have dissenting views, to express them in private rather than in public. And so that's why I think you don't necessarily see at an institution like MIT the trustees coming out and airing public disagreement with the administration. Although it does periodically happen, and it actually happened last year around some issues about student conduct, where the trustees took a position. The position itself was not publicly communicated, but the results were, there were concerns expressed within the board about how the student discipline system was operating. And that was in the context of the the Israel and Palestine debates that were happening. And in response to that, MIT has actually refined its student disciplinary system, partly in response to the concerns expressed by the trustees. So, in general, I do think that this is happening at MIT, but it's not generally being aired in public.
Gentlemen, one last question before we open it up to Q&A and discussion. What specific advice, if any, would you give to new trustees, and what resources are available to trustees that you would recommend? And I'd open it up slightly. All of us, I suspect, serve on boards, committees, not just boards of trustees, and so, and many of these same issues, of course, come up on other boards. And so, broadly, what recommendations would you have? Michael?
Well, not only for MIT, but all around the country. The first one is be there. If there's a controversial speaker coming to campus, be there. Be there clearly and publicly. Whether I agree or not with Milo Yiannopoulos, I'm here because this was a legitimate invitation, and we are a campus that lives by, whether it's the Chicago Principles or the C. Van Woodward Report, to think the unthinkable and discuss the unmentionable. That's what we do. Along with that, to really deeply become informed. If there's data that is necessary to understand the operation of the school, then make sure that you can get that and that it's shared with other colleagues. And also to think broadly as a fiduciary. It's not just finance. It's increasingly, as anyone who reads the newspaper sees, it's campus climate, it's academic standards, being on top of things like grade inflation. Do you know what grade distribution is like? MIT is not a place that suffers the way, say, Princeton and Harvard in particular do, but keeping an eye on these metrics is really quite important.
Michael, I totally agree about the importance of being present and being present in not just, you mentioned campus speakers, but more generally. And so I do think one of our duties is to just make sure that we're in touch with what's happening on our campus. Another, I think, maybe obvious one, but it's worth saying, I think we owe a duty to the institution to express our honest opinions. So if we think something is wrong, or maybe policy is being promulgated that we disagree with, I think we owe it to express those disagreements in private, not necessarily publicly, but that is our responsibility, is to speak up.
Here's a bit of advice I'd offer from my experience on the corporation. Different issues people will self-censor themselves on at different times. When I was served, it was DEI and affirmative action that people would not speak out about or against, or the excesses thereof. And so you have to listen sometimes very closely to what your fellow trustees or board members, whatever the board is, are saying to get a sense for who might have the same views that you do, but is unwilling to express them. And then after you have a sense for which ones might be, if you get to know them outside of the board meetings, chat with them and so forth, and see where their real views lie, you may find that you have a fellow traveler that you didn't realize, even though they never speak up. Well, I did that, and out of the 60 or so trustees who come to MIT Corporation meetings, typically, I was able to identify maybe 8 or 10 who had the same views as I did. I assembled an email list, and we shared thoughts. And there is strength in numbers, and that gives people confidence to speak up. And people did speak up after that, more so than they had previously. So that's one bit of advice I'd offer trustees. As far as resources go, I'd like to mention a new course that's available on Coursera. It's called Speak Freely, Think Critically. And the executive director and editor of that course is here in this room, Barbara Oakley. Barbara, would you please raise your hand? Barbara is a professor at Oakland University in Michigan, and she has the distinction of creating Coursera's most popular course ever, Learning How to Learn, which was one of their very early MOOCs, massively open online courses, and which has millions of students who've taken that course now. And Speak Freely, Think Critically is her latest work. I understand we're going to get to see an excerpt from the course. Anyway, it's hugely educational, hugely informative, brings in logical aspects of free speech, and I think you'll enjoy it very much, so recommend it. Let's open it up for questions.
Before
did
we
I
do that, can I
Yes,
just-
yes, Steve, go ahead.
Just with regard to John's comment about his experience on the board back 2015 to 2021, and finding a relatively limited number of trustees who shared your views about the importance of freedom of expression. I'm definitely not disagreeing with John's perception, but I will say I think it's a little different now, which is I think it's a significantly larger number. And I suspect that the change was probably, again, the trustees became educated because of the Abbott affair. Yeah. And that just like the administration and the faculty had a wake-up call, I think maybe the trustees did too. And so I do think you see, in my opinion, I think there's more willingness to, within the board, to debate and encourage greater exchange of ideas, freedom of expression today than perhaps there were even just 5 years ago.
Michael, did you have anything to add?
I was just going to say, for sheer inspiration, I put some of ACTA's publications out on the table where you came in, including Nadine Strassen's wonderful exploration of cancel culture and how to fight it. It's a recent work, but it's a classic work, and it reminds us of all the things that we have to do.
Yes, and that table with ACTA's materials is opposite the registration table. I didn't notice it when I came in, but if it is out there, so if you would look for it. Okay, you, sir, have a comment or question.
Hi there. My name is Yossi Shefi. Hi, John. Finally meeting you.
Good to see you.
We had the discussion over the phone. I must admit that I came with very high hopes, and I was disappointed by this morning panel. And let me tell you why. First of all, you said that Dorian Abbott was a wake-up call. I don't recall having any more, invitees like this coming on campus. So we learn our lesson, keep it down. Don't do it again. Don't invite people, let's say, conservative speakers, different type of speakers on campus. I don't recall one conservative speaker. In fact, the amazing thing, a good friend of mine, Tom Friedman, who is not conservative at all, of the New York Times, said he doesn't come to campuses anymore because he's disgusted by what's going on, and that's from his side. Just a few comments about what you guys say. We have different views of Sally. I understand. That's okay. I have a view from the ground. But I think that the idea that the board stood behind Sally as a knee-jerk reaction, she was not a reformer when she spoke in Congress, and the knee-jerk reaction actually diminished the board, I think, because there was no reform. She was not arguing for something. She stumbled, okay. She had no experience. I didn't see any reason for the board to support it. About getting student opinion and listening to them, I think our job is to educate them and train them. And listening should be, yeah, we should listen to them as part of it and respond, but our main job is educate. You mentioned the disciplinary, the board did something on the disciplinary. It just amounted to nothing because there was no follow-up. What happened is, for those who don't know, the board suggested, the main suggestion was that there will be an outside lawyer, outside legal help for the people who are afraid of the students and afraid of making decisions. It was a great suggestion, which was, of course, rejected, because this would mean that it will be a real disciplinary process. And at MIT, it seems like people didn't want real a disciplinary process. Let me just go back to something that Ian, who became my hero in the last few years. When we put together the statement at MIT, what you forget is that lots of faculty were against it. In the faculty. I'm not talking about, fringe. Lots of faculty were against it. And still, when I say against it, I should say they're not against free speech. They are free speech to voice their opinion. They're against free speech for mostly conservative or Republican, or the other side if you want to voice their opinion. So it's not that against free speech, it's against certain kind of free speech. So I'm, finally, you say, getting to know what's going on at MIT. The board has a huge hurdle this. Most of the time people don't go like you say, you go and talk to students, which is wonderful. In most cases, you see what the administration wants you to see. That's, by the way, in every board. I'm serving on multiple boards. In every board, the problem is that management can control what the board sees and hears. It's very hard to punch through and understand what's going on. It's very hard to know which faculty members, which students, which administrators to speak to. I know that in the case of what happened on campus with anti-Semitism and all this, the administration decided to invite people who will say it's not a big deal. It doesn't happen. I wrote, let me just finish with that. I wrote 9 books in my area, supply chain management. I'm now writing a book about the experience of Jewish students at MIT since October 7th. I have a problem. I cannot finish it because whenever I sit and I interview 50 students. Okay. Whenever I sit and sit down and I think about how the administration responds, I get so angry that I cannot write.
Gentlemen, any reaction or comments?
I was going to compliment you for what you said. Don't let your anger block you from doing something of great importance. We need the transparency.
Thank you for those remarks and appreciate the criticism. I would just say yeah, that's constructive. I would just say with regard to your comment about the disciplinary system, as I mentioned earlier, it's a big place and it moves slowly, but in fact, changes are happening. Right now, there's a faculty committee that is considering the recommendations of the corporation.
They already presented the recommendation and declined, basically, the recommendation of the, we saw the board, some of us saw the board. And there was a faculty, and they gave their, there was a faculty meeting.
Okay.
They gave their response. And the response was, we're doing just fine. That was the response. And by the way, on the committee, there were members of IDLR, of the district, which of course defended their action, which is nuts.
Frank.
Thank you, John. So Frank Larkin, class of '84, and I'm a MIFSA board member. To follow up a little bit and maybe turn it into a question, would the MIT Corporation be willing to listen to these new voices that have come up in the ecosystem of MIT, like MIFSA after the wake-up call or turning point of the Dorian Abbott cancellation, like the new faculty, MIT Council on Academic Freedom, Ian and others are presenting them and leading them. I think getting, to your point, unfiltered voices from this broader ecosystem to the corporation that are not perhaps somewhat influenced by the staff or administration that presents it to them. I'll give you two examples. I heard last night a story that maybe Mark Gorenberg was told that the Dorian Abbott cancellation was mostly a logistical mishap and not really intended. Wow, if he was told that, then the communications are influenced. I saw something very recently about the unfortunate cancellation and ousting of David Sabatini at the Whitehead Institute and in the School of Science, where new facts have come out of the discovery that is now going on in the courts. We're doing the right thing by the corporation, by Sally, by Anantha and others would be important, but the information giving to them, the narrative by people who were involved in this ousting is heavily, heavily biased and without even disclosing their involvement. These are examples where the question then is, would the corporation entertain Wayne or someone from MIFSA giving them a 10-minute, 15-minute presentation? Would they entertain listening to the leadership of MIT, the Faculty Council on Academic Freedom, to get some unfiltered views?
Thanks, Frank. So I can't speak for the corporation about what it will or will not do. I can say that individual members of the corporation, many of them, I think, work very hard to communicate with various groups. I'm a member of MIFSA. I'm here, and I know that from conversation with other members of the corporation that many of them do try and communicate directly with various groups. As I said, I often get in front of student groups, for example. And there are other members of the corporation that do, elsewhere. A lot of us have direct contact with many faculty, and so I don't think we're just hearing the party line, as it will, but I think people, many of us are trying to educate ourselves. So as far as your question about whether we would entertain outside speakers, I can tell you that in my experience thus far as a member of the board, that has not been done. That we do hear in every meeting from the chair of the faculty, who is charged with expressing what the faculty are thinking. So it kind of bubbles up through that. But no, it has not been the practice in my experience to invite outside people. So, you mentioned Wayne, to invite people like Wayne to come and present. That has not been done.
So we're at at the end of our time. I'm sorry, I know we didn't have enough adequate time for questions. Thank you, John, Stephen, and Michael, for providing the perspective of